mini equity index futures, right? I quickly mentioned them earlier, the ES. Well, the S&P 500, on which the ES is based, is a broad-based market capitalization weighted index. So there's a few big words in there. Let's break them down. Broad-based means all kinds of businesses, all kinds of sectors, okay? It's not just technology like the NASDAQ. It's not just small cap like the Russell. It's pretty broad in who gets to be in the S&P 500. And the S&P here stands for Standard & Poor's, and that's the organization that decides who is in the S&P 500 at any given time. Yes, you can get kicked out and you can get brought in. Now, market capitalization simply means the size of that company. So let's just take Apple or Tesla or Nvidia because they're huge companies that we've heard of, right? They have big market capitalization because it's simply the formula of the share price times the number of shares outstanding. That's the size of the company in its dollar value. Now, weighted index means that there are different importance levels essentially given to stocks in the S&P. They're not all treated equally. So for example, I mentioned Apple. Apple has a much larger weight than some other stocks in the S&P, okay? So the way that the S&P 500 prices is not representing all stocks equally, but that's not a bad thing. It's just a factor to know. Now, the bigger the market cap, the more the weight of the price of that stock on the S&P 500 index movement. So like I mentioned with Apple. And again, that tracks about 500 of the largest US companies in leading industries, and it is the key indicator of the health of the US market. So if you're trading at all, you want to be aware of what's going on in the US because our economy is leading. In the US, the stock market is probably the market that performs the best. And the S&P 500 will tell you in the most succinct way what's going on in the US stock market. Not just of those 500 stocks, but of all the stocks together. So it doesn't matter if you don't trade futures directly or the S&P directly, you need to know what it's doing, all right? Because here's the thing, Wall Street looks at the S&P 500, but Main Street generally looks at the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And I've tested this out, okay? I remember back early when I was working in Manhattan at a research firm on Wall Street, and my mom was driving me when I was still living at home to save money on an apartment. And she was driving me to the train station, and I just randomly asked her, Mom, what's the stock market? And her answer was, I don't know, the Dow? That's the first and only thing she knew of. My mom is a wonderful, intelligent woman, but she is not well-versed on financials. So that's why the Main Street looks at the Dow, but professionals look at the S&P. Now, the E-mini S&P 500 futures. The E stands for electronic. The mini equates to smaller than the big S&P 500 futures contract. So the S&P 500 can be traded by a large S&P, but here's the difference, okay? Again, the E-mini is one of the most liquid futures contracts on the planet, if not the most liquid at any given time, allowing you to take those positions on the performance of the S&P, but with smaller accounts and lower risk, and it's at this more reasonable price. So here's how it prices out, okay? The E-mini S&P is priced in points. Each point has 4 ticks in it, and each of those ticks represents $12.50. So if there's 4 ticks in a point, then 1 point is $12.50 times 4, which is $50. Now, just like other futures contracts, they have a lifespan. They don't just last forever. Like a share of Apple, right? You can buy and hold for years, and you don't have to do anything to manage it. You just have to be aware if the stock splits or anything like that. But with futures, they have an end date. Now, for E-mini S&P 500 futures, that end date is each quarter. Specifically, March, June, September, December. All the information is on the exchange that trades the E-mini, and we'll look at that in a moment. There are also options available, and this is something our tribe uses too. So I like to trade the E-mini S&P 500 futures contract directly, like buy a contract, sell a contract, right? But you can also apply option strategies.